So our next unit is the center spike unit, and it has section 1 in the middle, and line 1 is on the left, so that means you put the CS2 on the left next, and then line 2 is on the right, so you're going to work towards the right and put a CS2 on the right, and then the next line 3 is on the left again, so we're going to be working back and forth throughout this piece. So we're going to start with the center spike, and I have my pinks and oranges for the center spike. That one is the very first one. And then underneath it, I'm going to put the CS2 left. So I have all my pieces on the left, and it's a background piece. So there's my CS2 for the left side, and the sew side is the long edge. So we're going to put the long edges together. Then we're going to work over to the right, and we want the CS2 on the right. So here's my CS2. It says right side, and it has a sew side as well. So we're going to put that underneath those. Then we're going to work over to line number 3, which is the CS3 on the left, and it's a spike. So here's my left spike, CS3 with a sew side. That goes underneath that. And then line 4 moves back over to the right side again, and we have a CS3 on the right, which is a spike. And there's my right side CS3, and that goes below that. Now we're going to work on the backgrounds again, and we want a CS4 on the left. So here's my background. It says left side template CS4, and it has a sew side. And we're going to go back over to the right side again, and that wants a CS4 on the right, and we have a background right side template CS4 with a sew side on the long edge, so that goes underneath the pile. And we're going to finish off with some spikes. We have a CS5 on the left. This says left spike CS5, and it has a sew side that I'm going to place up on the top on this edge away from me. And then the last one is on the right, and it's also a CS5. And here's that CS5 right, and it's got a sew side. So that goes underneath the pile. So now they're all stacked in the order that we're going to sew them, and they're stacked with the sew side away from us, like that. So now we start the same way we started the last unit. We look at our center spike. We have our pile of center spikes, and they're going to be oriented in the same way as the one that's in the middle of the piece, and it's also going to be facing right side down. So these were cut right side up, but now they're out of order. So let me pull from the top of the pile and just turn it over right side down. I would say it doesn't matter because I'm working all with batiks, but there is one fabric in here that is not a batik. So we have to make sure when we glue it to the paper, we glue the wrong side to the paper. So I'm just going to take my flashlight on my phone, and I'm going to look at my paper through it. I'm going to take the first piece, and I'm going to make sure that it covers all the areas that it needs to cover. And I can see that covers nicely. And it only needs to cover down to the middle of this curve. So that's where it needs to be. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue on there. If you don't want to glue, you could pin instead. Because sometimes the glue is hard to get off of the fabric when you're peeling papers. So that's our first one. I'm just going to leave it right side down, and I'm going to make a stack with all of them. And again, I can tell that that's going to cover the whole thing just like that. You don't need a lot of glue, just enough to hold it. in place. And then here's my fabric that's not a batik. So I'm going to make sure that I turn it with the wrong side against the paper. And when I look at it, I see the right side is up. You can also do this so that your two lines are pretty much right on the dotted seam allowance line. And it'll save you from having to trim that first line. See what I mean? There's the dotted seam allowance line on both sides of line 1 and line 2. And if you take your piece with the wrong side against the paper and you have a good enough light going through it, you can see right where those dotted lines are, and you can line up your fabric right on those dotted lines, and then you don't have to trim. Because this one is in the center like this, it's not going to screw up your grain line. It's going to stay the way it needs to be. So I'm going to glue mine this way, and then I don't have to do that first step where I fold back on line 1 and trim. It's like I already did it, and I can go right to adding the second piece after I glue this. I'm not a fan of trying to peel the paper off of the glued pieces, so I like to pin. So I glued the first few, but I'm going to pin the rest of these. And here's that fabric with the right and wrong side, so I'm going to flip it over. With the wrong side against the back of the paper. I'm kind of holding it down with my finger so it doesn't move when I put that pin in. I'm only setting up 16 of these to do, like I did 16 of the small ones to start off with, because it's a little different. And it doesn't get as boring if you're doing 64 in a row or 62 in a row of one particular unit. So I'm going to break it up a little bit, and I'm going to move on to these, and then I'll go back to the little ones. But they both have to be done because the little ones fit right inside these as one unit when they're put together. Now when I go to put my CS2 on, these are all right side up, so I want them right sides together with the other part, 1. So I do still have to fold back so I can see the edge of my spike. But it doesn't have to be perfect because we already know there's a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now my sew edge is the long edge of this triangle, so I'm going to place it right sides together. I'm going to match that sew edge. So when I go to place it, I know that it has to fit behind this section, section 2. So if I place it too low on the line and it fills out this part of the paper, it's not going to cover behind here. So I want to make sure that I place it up high enough up in here so that it fills in behind section 2, and I can see the way it overlaps there that it's going to fit behind section 2. So every time I place them, I'm going to place them up high here. So I can make sure that all of mine are placed the same. If I take my next piece, and I fold it on line 1. And I can take the next piece in line, and I can match it to where I had the last one, and just lay it down. I'm going to stagger them a bit so that I can see what I'm doing here. And then this one gets placed just in line with the last one. And this is why I'm staggering them, so I can see the one before it. So I take the next one, and I make sure it's folded on line 1. You can use your template to fold it down. I'm just doing it with my thumbnails, because all I really need to see at this point is the raw edge. Out to the edge there, so that these points are all meeting over here. And so that these points are all meeting over here. And turn it this way so you can see what I'm doing. So the next piece off gets placed so that these points are even. And the next piece on the pile that's already stuck to the center spike fold it on line 1, or at least enough that I can see that raw edge, and I'm going to place it so that it's matching the ones before it. And that way my pile is stacked and ready to sew. And I can pick each of these up one at a time and put it right on my machine and sew it on line 1. And there's the last one. So they're all stacked so that these edges are even and these points sticking out here are even. So we know they're all lined up the same. I'm just going to put them right next to me here. And I'm going to start working on them. So I picked the first one up off the pile. Both pieces are stuck together with the raw edges even. I just want to make sure that they're even when I pick them up. And then I bring it over to my machine. And I still make sure they're even. I have to keep checking underneath there as I'm sliding it under the foot. And I put the needle down in the end of the solid black line 1. I can pull that pin out now. Because I've put my needle down. And I want to make sure that my raw edges are even on this side and that they fall right underneath the dotted seam allowance line on line 1, and I can see that they do. Now I might want to check this first one because I have them all lined up to match it. And I can see that it's going to cover the section it needs to cover. So I know I'm good. So when I pick up the next one, it should be already good to go. And I open up the paper and lock it before I take out that pin. And I make sure the raw edges are even. And I make sure that this is, you can actually feel it when you press on it. You can feel the raw edges right along the edge of that seam allowance line on the dotted line. Now you can go one step further and make it a little safer for them to not move by taking your glue pen to your pile, and all you need to do is make sure your glue's out a little bit, and you lift up the seam allowance line and you just daub a tiny bit of glue to hold it in place. You press it down, and you do that with the next one. And it's glue in the seam allowance, so it's not going to be anything that's a problem later. And press it down. And then you know that they're not going to slip. If you don't want to bother using glue and you're just totally comfortable moving it over to your machine without the glue, that's okay too. This is just another way when you're a new paper piecer to keep your pieces steady and stuck together in the right way. And then you don't have to worry about it when you pick it up to move it over to your machine. And I don't butter it, I just use little dots of glue. My glue's near the end of the stick, so it's kind of wonky looking. So the pin's holding one and the glue's holding the other to it. So now that I've glued them, they stay together pretty nicely. They don't slip around. The longer the seam, the more apt I am to glue it, to keep it from twisting off the mark. Oh, and I see the pin in there. I'm holding it in place on the paper so when I take the pin out it doesn't move, and then I just place it underneath. And it's the same steps you did with the little units. You cut them apart, you fold it, you use your add a quarter ruler to trim it, and then you place your next piece, and then you sew on the solid line. You never sew on the dotted line, that's just the seam allowance line. It's there to let you know whether you have placed your fabric properly and whether it's going to cover the entire section that it needs to cover. So I'm going to take these over to my iron and I'm going to press them all. They're much bigger, so I don't want to just finger press them. And they're not all batik, so they don't lay as flat. So I'm going to go press all these. So I pressed them all, and I'm going to come back and trim line 2. It might not need to be trimmed because of the way we laid down the first piece, but we're going to check it out anyway because it needs to be laying flat. Just a little tiny bit gets trimmed off. Hardly anything, but it's better to do that than to leave it. So I'm going to just stack them right here. And there's a little corner you have to tear on line 2. Again, very little gets trimmed off of that. Now they're all trimmed, and the next step is to put on section 3. So here's section 3. It's actually marked background right side template CS2, but it is the third section we're putting on. And the sew side is clearly marked as this long edge. And I can see that I'm matching my background with my background, so I know I have the right piece. So it stays like this. And I think if I just match my points on this end up here, it's going to be mirrored on the other side. So to test it out, I'm going to lay it flat, and I'm going to fold it on the 1/4 inch mark, and you can see that it's definitely going to cover this section here. I have extra, lots of extra. So I'm just going to line these all up so that the points are pretty close together. I could stack the whole pile like I just did the first one, but I find it's a little quicker if I just grab from the top of the pile and add it to my next piece. So that's what I'm going to do this time around. And this one stops in the middle of the unit, not on the edge of the paper, but don't worry about it. It's supposed to stop right there on the end of the solid black line. So I pick up my next piece, and I pick up the next piece off my pile, and I'm going to match my points up here. And keep my raw edges even. And then I can put my needle right in and make sure that I didn't twist anything underneath, and I'm ready to go. We just ran out of bobbin, so I'm going to change this bobbin. It's a shuttle bobbin, and when I pull the door, it lifts the shuttle right out of there. It's called a transverse shuttle, and it has a long bobbin in it. There it is. It has a nice long bobbin in it like that. And that's what we were winding earlier. So this is what the transverse shuttle looks like. It's like a little boat, and it holds the long bobbin. There's one end of the bobbin doesn't have a hole in it, and the other end of the bobbin does have a tiny little hole in it. The tiny little hole end gets put at the point down here, and then the bobbin itself lays nicely right inside that transverse shuttle. Then the thread comes off and goes into that little slice and around a wire. I can see a wire at the end here. Goes around the wire and back in that little slice, so that now it's behind the wire on the inside of the shuttle. And it comes over here to where there is another little slice in the leaf spring, and with my thumb I can help guide it into that slice and down under this leaf spring so that it comes out sideways right there. And I have to make sure it's pulling freely, and it does. I think I filled it a little too much, so I'm going to pull some off of it and make sure it pulls freely. There we go. And when it lays back in, it lays with the spring side up, so the boat is actually sideways in there. Just lays down. And then you hold the top thread, and I crank it one time. There it is. And it pulls that bottom thread up. And that's how you load a transverse shuttle. I was lucky, it just happened to run out at the end of a piece. If it runs out in the middle of the piece, you just start in the middle of the piece after you've put in the new bobbin. I pressed them all nicely and they're ready to go. So now I'm going to trim them. I'm going to keep them in order. So we sewed on line 1 and line 2, and now we're going to trim on line 3. We make sure that it's facing right side up, not upside down. And we put our template on line 3, the solid line, and fold it toward us. And trim. So I'll go through this whole pile and I will stack them. And then I will put on the next section, which is a left CS3, and we already have it stacked in the right place. It's just important to keep them in the right order, so don't confuse them when you're trimming. Okay, so the next on my pile is left spike template CS3. And you can see the spike is the right color. So we're just going to go ahead and place it. And the spikes center more towards the curved edge. So I'm going to make sure I hang over a little bit on that curved side, because this has to cover, and it does. So I've pressed them all and they're ready to trim. And I'm going to take one at a time, and I'm going to look. I've sewn line 1, line 2, line 3. So my next line is line 4. So that's the line I'm going to trim. And it's the same way we trim all of them. You make sure that you can read line 4 and that it's not upside down. And you always put the template on the solid line, and you always fold the paper toward you, and then use your add a quarter ruler. So I'm not going to make you watch this whole thing. I'm just going to trim them all, and then I'll show you how we put on the next piece. And it's the same as we've been putting them all on. You match a raw edge with the right sides together. So let me finish this and I will get back to you in a moment. So they're all trimmed, and now it's ready for the next piece, which is the right side template CS3. And I know that because when I look at my unit, I can see that I've sewn line 1, 2, and 3, and now I need to sew line 4. And so the fabric is going to be covering this little spike right here, and it says CS3 right. And this says CS3 right. And there is a sew side. So again, we've already trimmed them all. And it just matches up, right sides together, and we sew. You can go ahead and stack all these and glue the seam if you wish, and then sew them. I prefer to just hold on to them. Here's a situation where the piece I'm putting underneath is lighter than the piece that's already on the paper, and so when I put it on, I'm going to leave a little bit of the lighter color showing instead of matching up those raw edges perfectly even. And there won't be any shadows on the quilt that way. So that's the middle 3 spikes, and I'm just going to keep on going. Line 5 is next. Okay, so I've trimmed the last one, and now it's time to put on the next piece, which is the background left side template C4, and it's done the same way all the other ones are done. You match the sew side with the raw edge that you just trimmed and stitch. So now that I'm placing the one that goes to the edge of the paper, I want to make sure that it's going to cover it all. And I know that if I do this and I cover that, it fits perfectly. So all I have to do is slide it right behind so that this point and the point on the fabric are in the same place. And once again, I always check the first one, and it covers everything it needs to cover because we're filling this section. So now I'm trimming line 6. I'm going to stack this one so that you can see how that's done again instead of just pulling from the top. So here's my next section, and the sew side is the long side there. And I'm going to place it underneath this piece. And I want to make sure that it covers the area, and it does. So I can see where my 2 points are. And I can take my next piece. I can lay it down like that. And then after I cut this one, line 6, I can place it on top. Right in line with the one that's underneath it. And it'll be all lined up and ready to go. I can see easily that it's covering the paper. So if I line my next one up in the exact same spot as the one underneath it, I know it'll cover it. Okay, there they are, all stacked and ready to go. We're working on the solid line 6. So they're all pressed and ready to go. We're going to start trimming on line 7. And if I want to stack them as I go, I'm going to grab my next pieces. And I want to make sure that I'm using the right color spike, and I am, so I can go ahead and stack that. I'm just going to check, make sure that it's going to fill the area it needs to fill. And that's where it needs to be. So I can get the next one ready right where that one went. And I'll continue to stack these. I'll sew them, press them, and then we go on to the last section with line 8. So they're all stacked and ready to go, and I'm just going to sew them and press them and then come back and trim line 8, which is my last line, so that I can put on my CS5 right. All pressed and ready to go. Now I'm going to trim on line 8. So here's my last section, CS5 right. And the sew side's the long side away from me. It's going to go right under there. And just to make sure that's a good placement, I tip it over and I look at the first one. And it looks good. This is the last piece to this unit, so I can press them all really nice and then trim around the edges when I'm done. Line 8, stacked and ready to go. All pieced. Now I'm going to press them and trim the edges, and then we'll be on to our next unit, the flying geese. So 4 of these sides need to be trimmed with a ruler, and the other one is a free-form trim. I'll show you how I do that. Just like the little ones, instead of it's a concave curve instead of an obtuse one. So it's the same method though. Just doesn't want to cut. And I have a new blade on this rotary cutter. And so to do this, I'm going to just start. I don't know whether I want to start this side. I think this side's easier for me. So I'm going to start so I can see my blade on the line, and I'm just going to spin this as I go. There we go. There's a unit. So happy. It looks like a crown. So I've sewn 16 here. There are a total of 62, I believe, in the pattern. So I have some more sewing to do. More piecing. But I'm going to move on to the flying geese right now and show you how to do those. And then at your own leisure you can finish the 62 small M units and the 62 center spike units and whatever we don't finish of the flying geese.